Well, Vicky has just given you the good news. I'm afraid I'm going to give you the bad news. I'm going to give you a diet of gloom, occasionally interrupted by pessimism. Capitalism has always been an extraordinary, dynamic, and disruptive economic system. Here you have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848 saying all that is solid melts into air. You have Schumpeter saying in 1942 that capitalism is about the perennial gale of creative destruction. My favorite novel about capitalism is Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, which presents this world that is stable, organized, beautifully bourgeois, and then suddenly, because of a badly timed bet on the futures market in grain, it completely collapses. And that, I'm afraid, is the nature of capitalism. But even by capitalism's rather ruthless standards, I think the 21st century has been a very difficult one. It started off with a series of corporate collapses, Enron, WorldCom, Arthur Andersen, some of the world's most revered and seemingly, in the case of Arthur Andersen's, totally stable companies completely collapsing. Then you have a brief moment of recovery, then 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the global financial crisis, the destruction of literally trillions of dollars of global wealth. And then we have Brexit, and then we have Trump. So far, the 21st century has been an extremely difficult one. It's a period of extreme disruption. What's driving this process of disruption? I'm going to go through the classic drivers and try and say something about them, and then go on to say why I think the world is again changing. The first and most important, of course, as we just heard, is technological innovation. I don't regard myself as being that old, but I remember when I started writing my PhD thesis, typing with a manual typewriter and Tipexing out all the mistakes. Now, that looks completely crazy to the average person today, but it wasn't that long ago that we were doing that. The PC has revolutionized our life. These mobile devices that we carry around all the time have revolutionized our life. In no time at all, you now carry in your pocket, all of you in this room, more computing power individually than MIT had collectively in the 1950s, and that is just changing business absolutely fundamentally. And the speed of dissemination of every new innovation is quite extraordinary, and it's getting faster. Joseph Schumpeter once said that Queen Elizabeth I had silk stockings. The genius of capitalism was not to provide Queen Elizabeth I with millions upon millions upon millions of pairs of silk stockings. It was to provide every shop girl in the world with easy access to silk stockings. Shop girl is his phrase, not mine. And that is what's happening with all these technological devices. Things that look avant-garde, that look completely new, that look like pioneering devices today are disseminated with incredible speed all around the world. It took, I think, it took 70 years for electricity to reach half the homes in the United States. It took 50 years for television to reach half the homes in the United States. It took the internet 10 years to do so. So these innovations are getting faster and they're getting more pervasive. The internet has evolved with extraordinary speed from something that you just look things up on, to something that you interact with, to something you carry around in your pocket, to something that talks to you and engages with you all the time. We have a lot of talk about how we're going to have internet-enabled, intelligent machines changing our lives. I think that's absolutely true. But just as important, and not talked about enough, I think, is the Internet of Things. Every piece of clothing that you're wearing, your drinks, your physical environment is going to become permeated with intelligence. It's going to be connected with the internet. It's going to be able to tell you, don't take that extra pint of Guinness in the evening. It's going to tell you when to take your medicine. It's going to tell you when to get up. You're going to be in a constant state of interaction with your environment, and traffic flows, everything of that sort will be intelligent. We will have an intelligent world that we will live in. That's an extraordinary set of changes. Secondly, capital markets, a rather more worrying set of changes. I think the sheer quantity of capital in the world is absolutely extraordinary. I think in 1980, in mutual funds in the United States, there was about 150 billion. Now there is 15 trillion just sitting in mutual funds. This quantity of money is unheard of, and the speed with with which it moves around the world also is unheard of. The capital markets put a constant pressure on every company that operates to produce higher, predictable results all the time. It's constantly putting a pressure on you. You know, it's an unforgiving logic of the capital markets. But at the same time, those capital markets are very, very unstable. We had an extraordinary near-death experience with the global financial crisis. We've done something to protect ourselves against a repetition of that crisis. Not enough, in my opinion. We haven't done enough to build up capital buffers. We've done something again, but that's constantly been negotiated down by the banks. We have a repetition of some of the problems with over-leveraged loans. And we also have, flooding into the market, vast quantities of capital from Asia and from the Middle East, which are much less well-regulated. So the chances of getting another big disruptive financial crisis are very, very high, I'm afraid. As well as all of this, uniting this and reinforcing all of this is the process of globalization. I can't think of a better place to think about globalization than this particular Docklands. You see an extraordinary set of global companies that are operating in the world. But I think globalization has been moving at an astonishing pace and is going to continue to move at an astonishing pace. I think that 2 to 3 percentage points, the emerging world will grow at 2 to 3 percentage points faster than the rich world for as far as we can see. So that shifts the balance of economic power relentlessly away from UK, Ireland, the United States towards the emerging world. McKinsey calculates that half of the growth in the world by 2025 will come from second and third cities in the emerging world. Cities that you and I have not heard of and not visited, but they are in charge of driving the growth in the world. So we have to start trying to know a little bit more about them, thinking a little bit more about them. But most of the dynamism of the world is coming from parts of the world that we don't really know very much about. And it's not just as it used to be. We used to think, well, we'd keep all the high value-added jobs and they would do all the grunt work, all the stitching of the Nike shoes and all of that sort of thing. That is increasingly not the case. Increasingly, high value-added stuff is coming from the emerging world. Increasingly, really good ideas, really good innovations are coming not just from the rich world, from the emerging world. If you look at the world of medical devices, this whole species of frugal innovation, cutting the costs whilst delivering most of the value, is headquartered in India. General Electric has its medical technology center, not in the United States anymore, but in India. So the logic of globalization is not only pushing just grunt work to the emerging world, it's pushing high value-added work to the emerging world at the same time. And these pressures are moving into whole new areas. I talked about the rise of robots, the rise of autonomous cars and things like that. That's a very important set of changes, and it's happening very, very fast. But I would also urge you to think about the professions. Think about the old professions which used to be shielded from disruption. We always used to say, get your son into the medical profession, get your son into the legal profession, get them into accountancy, because at least they're stable professions. They'll always have a job and they'll always be stable. These are being completely disrupted. They're being disrupted by massive companies which can exploit global economies of scale and scope and global talent markets to decimate whole areas. They're also being destroyed by TurboTax and things which allow individuals to do their own thing. The whole process of getting a job in McKinsey's or Anderson Consulting and the rest of it used to be that you'd spend several years doing fairly basic grunt work. That's how you were trained, and then you get a partnership. Now all of that work is being destroyed. It's being automated. It's being contracted out. There's no clear path to training people, to developing people in the future. The whole career structure of this world is being turned upside down. Or think of the public sector. This huge, very stable, very slow-moving world of the public sector is in the process, is just at the beginning of being reinvented, changed by these disruptive forces. You're having contracting out, you're having privatization, you're having the notion that the public sector doesn't consist of inward-looking bureaucracies anymore, but is a set of platforms which anybody can perch on to provide services for the public. So the basic building blocks, the stable building blocks of our world, I think, are not being destroyed, but they're being reinvented at a very rapid rate indeed. And what do we get for all of this? Well, we get automated rants in cars, we get a world in which we're all constantly looking at our iPhones. I'm sure many of you in this room are looking at your iPhones rather than looking at me, which I'm sure they're much more interesting than I am. But everybody is looking at these things. Everybody is in this inward-looking world. They're not paying attention to the world about them. You have constant stimulation, rather pointless messages coming all the time, but you can't take your eyes off it. You have this paradox of progress that we all have more power, we all have more access to information, but at the same time we feel slightly drained by this. We feel disconnected with our world, and we have this notion that we're all empowered, we have all this technology, we're all liberated to work better and more efficiently, but in fact we're all being asked to do more things more of the time, many of them that we're not really quite capable of doing as well as we should be. So we have a strange world, a combination of incredible empowerment of people, but also at the same time, I think a sort of disempowerment, or certainly a nervousness about the world that's coming. And I think what we're getting now is something else, which is the disruption of disruption. We've had a world disrupted by some fairly familiar things, technology, globalization, capital markets, and the rest of it, but now we may be coming to a world in which the most important determinant of what happens is the disruption of disruption, the backlash against disruption. You have the backlash against globalization, you have the rise of populism, you have the return of borders and frontiers, the end of this globalized world. There's a marvelous passage in Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace, when he talks about the average bourgeois Londoner in 1913. He's sitting there, he's lying in bed, he's drinking his cup of tea, he's reading the Times, he's investing in stocks all around the world, he's ordering things from all around the world, books, tea, whatever he wants, and it's all arriving in his bedroom, all being presented to him. And Keynes said he's lying there and he's thinking that this will only go on getting better and better, only go on getting more and more efficient. He's completely blind to the forces of xenophobia, nationalism, irredentism that are going to destroy his world in the next few years. That is what we all collectively have been. Collectively, we've all been Keynes's man lounging in his bed in 1913. We've all assumed that globalization can only go on getting bigger, only go on getting better, only going on getting more predictable. And I think that's changing. Trump is the most important change, of course, I think, because America is the linchpin of the global economic order. After the First World War, America basically retreated from globalization, turned its back on globalization, turned towards protectionism, turned towards putting barriers to immigration, and that set the tone of protectionism throughout the 20s and 30s. After the Second World War, America reversed itself rather gloriously and built the current global world. It embraced free trade, it embraced the building of the European Union. Now America is going back to its First World War, after post-First World War logic. Trump is a very aggressive presentation of that, but I don't think he's the only presentation of that. I don't think Trump will be replaced by a Clinton pro-globalist. Might well be replaced by a left-wing anti-globalist. But basically, there's a lot of discontent with globalization in the United States, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to be the engine of globalization. Then we have the European Union and Brexit, and I very much agree with what Janan was saying, that the removal of Britain from the European Union will reinforce all the worst tendencies, by which I mean all the French tendencies, towards protectionism, building up barriers, and not engaging in the rest of the world. It's a huge advance for France, and therefore a huge backward step for the world. What's driving? So this is what I see, the disruption of disruption. This could also be termed Brexit, but this is what's going on. And one reason for all of this is massive overreach, massive overselling, and massive over-pushing of globalization by the forces that have been in favor of globalization. I think a lot of it is their fault. And what's driving this, in my opinion, are two things. One is the great consolidation. What we were always told was that globalization, technological innovation, and the rest of it would produce a world in which we had more entrepreneurship, in which it was easier to found companies, in which there were more companies, in which companies were constantly being born and dying. And what we're actually seeing at the moment is a massive consolidation of capitalism with a very small number of huge companies, many of them with outposts around here, which have market shares which we haven't seen since the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, market shares up to 60, 70, 80, 90%, and which are eating the whole global economy. The size of the American stock market now, the number of companies listed on the American stock market has been reduced by half over the last 15 years. The size of those companies has increased by a third. The proportion of Americans employed by big companies is actually going up at the moment. At the same time, the number of companies being founded, this is all in the United States, but it's echoed around the world, the number of companies being founded is at a historically low point. The number of IPOs is at a historically low point. So we are seeing what we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, massive consolidation with a very small number of companies controlling, dominating a small number of markets. The second consolidation is, the second problem, which is driving the distemper that we see all around us, is what I call the Great Stagnation. Again, we were sold globalization, we were sold liberalization on the grounds that it would make us all richer. We'd have to put up with all of the disruption and the difficulties, but we would get richer, the economies would grow. In fact, productivity growth has been dismal. Again, these are going to be American figures, but they're not crazily out of whack. Between 1930 and 1950, productivity growth was 2.48% a year. 1950 to 1973, it averaged 2.77% a year. Then from 1973 to 1998, it slows down to 1.74% a year. And from 2004 to 2015, it's 0.6% a year. You're getting virtually no productivity growth. You're getting basically a stagnant economy in which more and more of the wealth is being consolidated in the hands of a few super companies. Fewer companies are starting off. And then society becomes a zero-sum game in which everybody's competing for the same resources, everybody's going head-to-head against each other, and you get rancid, angry nationalism and angry revolt against the social order. And I think what we're seeing now is a very new and very peculiar competitive landscape, which makes the world very difficult for all of us. One is that you're getting disruption plus stagnation. Everybody would be happy to put up with disruption if it meant you were getting richer. It's just like moving house or moving to a new job. You move house or you move to a new job if you're getting a better house or a better job. What's happening now is we're being told to move to a new house, but it's a worse house, or it's just exactly the same. We're being told to do a new job, but it's not any better job. We have stagnation plus disruption. That's an exceptionally dangerous combination. Secondly, we have a peculiar combination of globalization and anti-globalization, which all this technology is pushing globalization forward. It means that you can be destroyed by a company that comes from anywhere in the world. It means that anybody can go global. In Uzbekistan, they can set up an internet site. But at the same time, the regular rules that we've lived by in terms of globalization, in terms of lowering trade barriers, in terms of rules about taxation and things like that, are all being scrambled by this movement of populism. So you have to try and think both at the same time about globalization and anti-globalization. And finally, we have an issue of massive increase in the idea of business being accountable to people, where business is constantly being put through the ringer, told that it's doing the wrong thing, told that it ought to behave better. But how can business be accountable when it doesn't know who it's accountable to, because there's an incredible volatility there, or what it's accountable for? So again, a very difficult, and I think an unprecedentedly difficult business environment, I'm afraid. What do we do about it? I hope I haven't been too pessimistic here. What do we do about it? Above all, I think you avoid commitments. You avoid giving people long-term jobs. You avoid taking on any assets. You avoid taking on any long-term commitments. What you need to be is as agile and as uncommitted to the future as possible. And that is not very good for society as a whole, but I think that's exactly the sort of capitalism we have now. If you look at all the great companies that are redefining the world, such as Google and Netflix and the rest of them, they have very, very few commitments. They have virtually no assets. So I think Google is 6 times bigger than General Motors in terms of market capital, but it employs its 5th the number of people. They're all trying to do as little as possible in terms of making long-term commitments. We heard from Sherman about US Steel. US Steel was the Google of its day. US Steel was the high-tech, modern company that was reinventing the world. US Steel in 1901, when it was formed, employed 250,000 people. It had steel mills, it had assets, it was a big thing. It was stuck there in Pittsburgh in the United States. You couldn't move steel production anywhere else. Google now employs probably about 60,000 people around the world. It can move wherever it wants. It's a fluid, mobile company. So we have to be, I think, in order to compete with these companies, in order to stay alive in this world, incredibly flexible, incredibly uncommitted in the long term to the future. We have to prepare to be surprised, expect the unexpected, expect the Donald Trumps of this world, expect new trade laws that are very, very difficult to understand, expect competition to come from all sorts of very peculiar places. I mean, who would have thought if you were in the hotel business that your competitors would include all the houses nearby? Who would have thought if you'd been in the taxi business that your competitors would have included Joe Bloggs, who happens to have a car down the road and a vaguely working driving license? The degree of strange competition that we're seeing at the moment is extraordinary. And prepare to reinvent yourself constantly. I'm very impressed by the way that Facebook was losing the battle for mobile and reinvented itself in no time at all into a mobile-first company. I'm very impressed by Netflix. I remember Netflix had started off, they were posting things through your letterbox, which was much better than Blockbusters, but was a bit clunky. Now it's turned itself into an all-digital company that sends stuff down the internet. And it's done that not because it had to, but because it knew that it needed to be ahead of the competitors. So we have to constantly be aware of competition coming from everywhere in very, very strange forms and being willing to reinvent ourselves, which I think means being incredibly agile. Now, the president was, Michael Higgins was saying this morning that we need to have a more socially responsible, a more socially conscious, a more rooted business. I think he's right, in terms of the health of the wider society. But I just don't think it's happening. The companies that are defining the future are practicing what I call the capitalism of zero. They're trying to get us towards as few assets as possible, as few people as possible, because they know that the disruption is so great that they have to do that. And I'm afraid that disruption, as I say, the disruption is itself being disrupted by these forces of populism. So unfortunately, I think we talked about the precariat. We're moving towards an incredibly precarious and difficult world. And I think over the last 20 to 30 years, we've been willing to put up with disruption, a very difficult world, because we've been basically optimistic about technological innovation, about globalization, and the rest of it. I think the great challenge for the next decade or so is whether we can keep a social contract, whether we can keep social peace when we have to try and put up with the combination of disruption and pessimism, which I think is behind most of our political problems at the moment. Thank you.